Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Why is this program so biased? Although we cannot gather in person, I'm very pleased to welcome almost 200 alumni, parents, and friends of Tufts to this event from all over the world. I hope you've enjoyed Virtual Reunion Week, which has featured alumni panels, faculty lectures like this one, and several fun events for jumbos of all ages. There are still a few events left, so to register, please visit alumni and friends, all one word, .tufts.edu. My name is Vicki Garth, and I'm a member of the class of 1981. I've enjoyed being among my classmates this week celebrating our 40th reunion. Over the last 40 years, I've enjoyed a very close relationship with Tufts as an interviewer, leader of the London Alumni Chapter, an alumni council member, co-chair of the International Committee, and now as president-elect of the Alumni Association. I encourage you to get involved with alumni activities as it's a lot of fun and you meet some really wonderful jumbos. Before we begin, before I introduce Professor Allen, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You'll notice that your audio and video have been turned off to eliminate any distractions from background noise. We'll have an audience Q&A after the presentation, and if you would like to ask questions, please do so using the Q&A function. Please do not use the chat, and which should appear on the lower right portion of your screen. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be uploaded to the Tufts Alumni YouTube channel. Marianne will post the link to that page and you will receive an email when the video is ready for viewing. You'll notice the closed captioning is on. If you would like to turn this feature off, click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and click Hide Subtitles. Lastly, I'd like to call attention to our community values. Our goal is to create an environment where everyone feels welcome to participate, to ask questions, and to contribute respectfully to the conversation. Marianne is going to post those values now. I'm pleased now to introduce Professor Martin Allen, Associate Teaching Professor and Director of Online Programs in Computer Science. Marty Allen received his doctorate in computer science from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2009, where he worked on artificial intelligence and theoretical computing areas. While his undergraduate and first graduate degrees were in philosophy, he became interested in computer science as an opportunity to do collaborative and interdisciplinary research, recognizing the ways in which computing can be applied to subjects spanning both the sciences and the arts. Recently, he developed a course on ethical issues in computer science. The course introduces Tufts students to real-world situations where biases have infiltrated algorithms and to give them the tools that will allow them to evaluate and resolve for themselves ethical dilemmas they may face in technology, in their careers, or as members of society. Marty is here with us today to help us learn those same skills. No computer programming experience is necessary, which is good because I have none. Please join me in giving a warm virtual reception to Professor Marty Allen.
Thanks, Vicki. Nice to sort of see everyone. I'll be jumping into my slides in a sec. I just want to talk real briefly about where this material came from. I've been teaching at Tufts only for a couple of years, but I've been teaching in the field for about 15 years now. And in all that time, I've generally been teaching technical topics. So I teach courses in theoretical computer science, machine learning. I teach intro programming. I teach a lot of different things. But it tends to be about, how to do things and not whether you should do things. And our students and our department and our university have been really interested in thinking more about whether you should do certain things and what the sort of outcomes are socially, ethically, otherwise, of this sort of technical things that we know how to do. And so the course that I created was basically in response to that need that our students were expressing to us and that we felt we wanted to supply to them. And so what I'm going to do today is just talk about some of the things that we talked about in that class, one particular set of examples, and hopefully we'll get a little conversation going and we'll have something interesting to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen, 1 second, and then I will begin. So the topic I wanted to talk about today, as Vicky said, is bias in machine learning. And machine learning algorithms are everywhere these days, whether you know it or not. They are probably intersecting with your life. And so companies and institutions are using machine learning algorithms and programs and models, as we call them, to do all sorts of things like monitor your credit cards to look and see if anyone's posting fraudulent activity. When you apply for a home loan, a credit card, or some other form of credit, machine learning algorithms are often used to assess your credit worthiness before you even get to talk to a human being, if you do so. Resumes that you might send out, or that your children or grandchildren might send out, college applications likewise get pre-screened often at large institutions and large companies before anybody sees them, and that's done with a program often. Hospitals increasingly use this, as do doctors, in order to sort of predict health outcomes and determine who gets treatment and what sort of treatment they get. It's to help the doctors, but it's also to help them manage their time. And one of the examples we'll talk about today is an algorithm that's used for that technique in major hospitals, but has been shown to have some issues with bias. And there's a lot of such applications. And this problem of bias has popped up a lot in machine learning systems. And I'm going to talk about today some cases where that's happened, why that might have happened, and why it's such a challenge when you're building these models. And so the questions I want to answer briefly, and I'm probably not going to answer every question, but I'm going to do my best, is, on a very high level, how do some of these models work in the first place? So we have some sense of what it is to say that a machine learning system is in place. What does it mean when we say that a system is biased? It has a technical meaning from statistics, but it also has a meaning more familiar to most of us. Then the question is, well, if there are biases in systems, where do they come from? How do they get there? And then lastly, maybe something we could think about together is, what can we do about this, or what should we do about this? So let's just talk, this is sort of square one where I start when I teach machine learning, and say, well, what is it for a machine to learn? That can be an interesting philosophical question, but as a computer scientist, we often like to think of this in a very cut and dried way. So I'm borrowing a definition that's pretty classic, comes from Tom Mitchell's 97 book on machine learning. And he says that you can analyze a situation in terms of three components. You've got tasks, things you want the program to do. You have a way of measuring performance. We'll call the set of tasks T, and the measure of performance P, how good it's doing. And you need to have that, otherwise you can't really tell if you're succeeding at your task. And then you have some data, and we can call that the experience, or E. And Mitchell proposes that, as a definition, we'll say that a program learns if the performance on those tasks in the T set gets better. So the measurement of the performance using this P measure improves based on experience, the data you feed in, that's E. So practically, what does this mean? Well, suppose I'm building a system, and this is a problem many people have worked on. We have these systems in our phones and in our homes, or at least some of us do. You want to build a speech recognition system, your Alexa, your Siri, or what have you. And the idea is that you want to be able to talk to this program through a microphone, et cetera, and it's going to do various things. It's going to run your phone, it's going to run your television set, whatever. And the question is, how do we build these models? And there's lots of different approaches, and some of them are highly technical. And I just want to talk about one really general framework, which is what we call supervised learning. And so the idea is, in supervised learning, is we create what's known as training data, and we feed that into a program, and it crunches a bunch of numbers, and it gets better at doing whatever it is we want it to do based on the data we give it. So in this case, what I do is I would start off by getting a bunch of sample things that I want some test users to say, and I'll get a group of people, testers, different voices, male, female, et cetera, different accents, et cetera, and I'll record them saying those things. So things like call my wife, set an alarm for 4 a.m., play Science Friday. We're imagining that we're building a system for your smartphone or something. And then for each of those things, I and people I work with sit down and we use our own human intelligence and we just figure out, okay, when somebody says those things, what do we want to happen? And so we identify some correct actions that the system could take. And, we write them down in some format that a program could understand. And so, we have what numbers should be called, how to set an alarm, how to play a podcast. And these are just the commands. And so that gives us a set of input-output pairs. And this is why we call this supervised learning, because the human beings in the loop are providing supervision. They're saying, here's what you're going to see as input, here's what you should give as output. And what you do is you create a whole bunch of those speech action pairs, and that's your experience, that's your data. And the job of the machine learning algorithm then is to take all of that and crunch that data and act in the correct way, in the sense that later, if somebody says something very similar, using the same words or similar words to those things, it will do the relevantly correct actions. Now, the hard part, of course, is that people's voices are all different. The exact phrasing and pacing is different. And so you're not going to have those exact people that you recorded saying those same things in exactly the same ways. And so the challenge is to sort of generalize from that. But that's the whole problem, right? Here's some things you already know we know the answer to. Now I'm going to give you some new things later, and I want you to give me the answer. So somebody else will say something, and it's your job, program, to decide what to do. And your job is to figure out how to get from my examples to the new things you need to do. And so in a very schematic way, right? The idea is that you take this training data, you input it to a program that usually involves converting it into a series of numbers and various other formal things. The program does something, and it produces output in the form of answers, actions to take, decisions to make, whatever. And then you ask yourself, well, did I get it right or not? And this is the main advantage of doing supervised learning, is because you start with this training set where you have the right answer written down already. So you can immediately see whether your program is giving the correct answer. And that's our performance measure. How close to correct or correct did it get? And then based on that measure of performance, we improve what the program does. And then the cycle repeats. So we keep feeding in data, it keeps giving us answers, we see how it does, and we improve. And now how does all that stuff work? Math. And I'm not going to do any math here today. I just want to mention math exists because it's part of my contract. I'm supposed to always mention math once a day. And so the program does some math, and that's how it turns data into answers. And then when you want to improve it, there's some more math. And that's actually usually the more complicated math. I mean, these programs can be quite complicated, but as I teach my students, a lot of times what the program's doing can look complicated, but when you get down to it, the math is actually pretty simple. It plugs in some numbers and crunches it and runs it through a function and spits out an answer. But the question is, how does it crunch those numbers? Well, that's the complex part. How do you get it to get better and better at crunching those numbers? And that involves more complex math, and sometimes you have to do calculus if you're unlucky. So that's about all the technical detail I'm going to give, though I'm happy to answer questions if people want to know more detail, because gosh knows I can talk about it at length. Let's think about bias. Okay, so people who've taken statistics hear about bias from the get-go, and this is something that I teach my students all the time to eliminate, because there's a technical sense in which bias in a machine learning case just means error, and usually it means systematic error, and it doesn't have that connotation that we have when we talk about one human being being biased towards another human being or group of human beings. But technically, what is bias? Well, it's just systematic error. So you have a program, and it's taking in features of the data, the way somebody's voice sounds, the exact words they say, whatever, depending on the problem. And then it's making some decisions, it's giving some outputs, and it's sometimes making mistakes. And so just as an example, right, I might have some data and it comes in, and this is just a simple case. I've got data about patients, and I know something about their BMI, their body mass index, and their blood pressure. And I've gone through with their medical records. And I've gone through for each of those patients, and I've sorted them into two groups, the healthy patients and the unhealthy patients. And so in this picture, the triangles are the healthy patients and the circles are the triangles are the unhealthy patients and the circles are the healthy patients. And they're scattered around this grid defined by BMI and blood pressure. Purely hypothetical, but that would be our supervised training data. We give the algorithm, the program, the BMI and BP information, that's your inputs. And we say, what are the correct outputs? It's this triangle or circle label, healthy or not. The machine crunches its numbers, and at some point, its job is to decide who's healthy and who's not. And it might be that the machine makes a prediction, and the prediction looks something like this, where it says, okay, everybody on one side of that line, you can see the arrow pointing sort of upward to the right, those are the unhealthy people. And the people to the sort of below and to the left of that line, those are the healthy people. And it just sort of cuts that line in between the data set, and that says, that's my predictions. And we can see that there's three individuals in that data set that it gets wrong. There's one circle, a healthy person, that gets labeled unhealthy, and there's two triangles who are unhealthy who get said to be healthy. That's going to happen, right? The error is some cases inevitable, because as these problems get complicated enough, it can just be the case that you don't have enough information to know for sure whether somebody's going to be healthy or not, or exactly what the answer should be. You could give this to a medical expert and they couldn't know for sure, because sometimes we just don't know. The world's a complicated place. So we want to remove this error if we can. The problem is we can't always do that. And that's something we just live with. We try to make our models as strong as possible, but they always have the potential for a little bit of bias, where just because of the way they look at the data, they get things a little wrong. That's not always a big problem for us. It's sometimes just the cost of doing business, and we live with it. Where does this become a problem? Well, where this becomes a problem, or where we worry about it the most, and this is where, I talk about this in my class on ethics and CS in particular, and this is the part that gets people most interested in this topic. It's not just, oh, sometimes these machines make error. That's interesting from a technical point of view. It's when the errors they make are correlated in some way with features, often of people, because that's what we tend to care about the most. They're not always, but they're correlated in some way that's unfair. Why would it be unfair? Well, if two groups are similar, let's say people, two groups of people, here I'm looking at people, healthy and unhealthy people, and in some respects, we think they're similar. So from the point of view of health predictions, they should have similar health outcomes. Then the system, if it's doing a good job, should probably make similar errors. If errors are inevitable, they shouldn't be more common for one group statistically than they are for another group, if those groups are relevantly similar. If there's something really importantly different about those groups, yes, maybe it makes more or less error. So if I looked at that data and I said, look, I've got this other feature, which I'm just calling feature number 3, and I've just drawn 3 ovals in the data, and let's just suppose that based on that feature, that's one other variable that's not part of our model. It's not BMI, it's not BP, it's not used by our algorithm necessarily, but it would break those 3 groups, those people into 3 groups. What we're seeing is that there's 2 groups, the one at the top that's all triangles and the one at the bottom that's all circles, for which the model's always correct. It's actually getting the correct answer. And there's this third group in the middle where it gets those people wrong. The triangles in that middle group are on the wrong side of the line, the dividing line, and so is the circle. Is that a problem by itself? Not necessarily. It depends what that feature number 3 is, right? And this is where bias becomes problematic. That error is problematic to us, and we think of it as bias in the sort of more everyday sense, if that feature number 3 is something that shouldn't cause more error for that group, but it does anyway. Then we think there's something wrong with our model. And so what shouldn't cause that? Well, we talk to medical professionals, and we might use our own common sense. And we say, look, if that is a feature, and it just happens that everybody in that group has the same feature, but that feature has nothing to do with whether they are healthy or unhealthy at different combinations of body weight and blood pressure, they're just as equally healthy, just as equally unhealthy as anybody else, then it seems like a problem that our model is making mistakes only about that group if that thing isn't supposed to matter. That's where we start to dig in and say, have we done something wrong, or has something gone wrong? Is this a case of bias that we should fix? Or is it a coincidence? With a tiny data set like this, obviously this is just a little picture I'm drawing for you here. This isn't the kind of data sets we deal with machine learning. You know, if you get 3 things wrong out of a very small data set, it might be meaningless noise, right? But this is where you start to wonder. And as your data gets bigger and you start to see bigger and bigger sort of patterns of bias like this, you start to really get concerned. So here's some examples. And these are just 2 that I chose because they've been in the recent discussion. There have been a ton of these examples over the years that people have discussed. This is probably one of the more famous ones from recent years. This is from a 2016 ProPublica report. ProPublica is a public interest research group you may be familiar with. And they looked at an algorithm called COMPAS. It's an acronym, doesn't much matter what it stands for. But what it is used for is for predicting the risk of recidivism. So COMPAS is used in some criminal systems to take individuals who have been convicted of a crime and run them through a scoring algorithm, and it predicts how likely it is that that person will commit another crime. And based on that risk score, judges and other legal professionals can make decisions, can influence the decisions they make about how people are sentenced, whether they get parole, things like that. And so if you're considered at a much higher risk of committing a crime again, often you're kept in prison longer, your parole terms are made more severe, et cetera. And I've got a couple links here. This will be in the recording later. I'm happy to supply them in my slides if people want them as well. What ProPublica found when they went through the data was that it seemed to be the case that the outcomes of this machine learning model, this algorithm, COMPAS, were skewed in different ways for different racial groups. And in particular, the kinds of mistakes it made for white defendants versus Black defendants were quite different. And so what they were finding was that if you were labeled high risk and the algorithm got it wrong, which, as I said, is going to happen. This is a complex problem, right? Predicting the future of how people's lives is going to play out. This is not a thing anyone has solved. But if it said you're a high risk and it made a mistake, which meant years later, we look at your criminal record and you never committed another crime, let's say 10, 15 years out, based on the data they had. Well, only 23.5% of the white defendants it looked at fell into that category, whereas, or 23.5% of those candidates were white, whereas 44.9% of those candidates were Black, which meant that it was labeling African-American defendants, Black defendants, much more high risk, even though they weren't reoffending at the same rates. Then on the other side, it looked at what's the other mistake you make. Well, you say somebody's low risk, but it turns out that, you know, within the next few years, they're convicted of another crime and they're back in the courts and back in jail. And among those low risk people who did reoffend, it was the opposite, where roughly twice as many of those were white. So it was making the opposite sorts of mistakes on both sides for these two groups, where it was often saying that the Black defendants who were high risk, when it turned out they didn't commit crimes again, and it was often saying white defendants were low risk when those same white defendants, when you followed up with them in a few years, did reoffend. And this was just because it was being used to actually, decide whether some of those defendants were given parole, early release, what kind of sentences they got in the first place. It was argued, an example of really pernicious bias in that algorithm. This is an argument that went back and forth for a while. There's an interesting MIT tech technology review article that kind of looks at the debate. It isn't something that's completely settled, but this is one of the more well-known cases. This is one I talked about with my students pretty recently because it only came out, well, when I taught the course, it was just the year before. It's a little over a year ago now. This is from Science magazine, big journal. And this is an algorithm that is used in hospitals. And this was actually an article written by a panel of doctors who also were experts in machine learning, which is rare, but they exist. And this was an algorithm that is used to kind of just keep track of patients. And as they're coming into the hospital, in a very large urban hospital, they were being sorted into groups. And the idea was that if you were thought to be at high risk of something, really having a bad health outcome, you would be put into immediately a program where you were monitored regularly. Nurses would visit your room more often. Doctors would, make sure they hit you on the rounds more often. You were sort of given more regular checkups while in the hospital, so kept monitored more closely. If you're registered low risk, it wasn't like you got ignored and they kicked you out of the hospital. Just meant that people didn't check in on you as much. You weren't as monitored as closely. Tests weren't run as frequently because it was considered low risk. And the hospitals were using this because they needed to prioritize because they had so many patients that, they couldn't give the same levels of care to everybody. So it makes sense why they were doing it. But what these doctors found was that this algorithm was exhibiting systemic bias as well. And so what this diagram is showing, the top line is the Black patients that the algorithm was evaluating in a large data set they had access to. And the bottom curve in a sort of yellow color is the white patients. Along the y-axis on the left-hand side, we have the number of actual known chronic conditions that those patients had. So it was things like hypertension, diabetes, various heart diseases, depression, things like that. And across the bottom, we had how the algorithm rated them, where on the left is low risk and on the right is high risk. And you can see there's a couple borderlines there. Right in the middle was where the patients were referred for a screening. So if the algorithm said you were about 55 on the risk scale, a doctor would come in and do like a screening test to just check in and make sure, which sort of real category you're in. Were you really high risk or not? If you were below that, you were put in a bed in the hospital and you were monitored on a sort of reduced schedule. If you were at a very high risk, that's the right-hand default into program separator, then you were just immediately sent into a constant monitoring program. They said a doctor doesn't even need to see you. Well, a doctor does need to see you. They need to see you a lot. They just don't need to do a test to tell that first. And so, in between those two boundaries, doctors would come in and they do some tests. And then if, they thought, yes, you do need lots of follow-ups, they'd do it. But the issue is, and again, we have to think about what all this data is showing. The issue is that the curve for the Black patients is significantly higher than the curve for the white patients. And what that means is that if you pick a spot along that curve, along the x-axis, that means those patients are rated at the same risk. But because the Black patients are systematically higher on the y-axis, it means that if you take two patients, a white patient and a Black patient, at the same risk level, the Black patient will tend to have significantly more actual conditions, worse health conditions than the white patient. And conversely, or let me just put it another way, it means that in order to get the same treatment, a Black patient had to be a lot more sick. And so, because of course, whether you get carefully monitored and all these sorts of things does correlate to, how well your stay in hospital goes, how long you're there, whether you come out, unfortunately. The fact that you had to be much sicker before the doctors would screen you, check in on you and stuff like that meant that for Black patients, a lot of times they were being denied care in this hospital that they really should have gotten. Or the white patients were getting care that they didn't need. Either way, it was a problem for the hospital and it was a case of bias, right? The paper's very interesting. It's worth a read. They go through the algorithm. They actually rerun it. They find ways of actually fixing the problem so that this disparity goes away, which I actually think was very constructive and interesting. One of its most interesting features I'll get to in a bit, because it's a question of where that came from. Because I'll say that in this case, though Compass is a commercial product about which the company doesn't like to answer questions to say exactly how their algorithm works. They're trying to sell it to American legal systems, but they don't like to explain how it works because it's a trade secret. This is actually an algorithm that's like publicly available, and the company wasn't trying to sell it at a profit. And so it was something that was designed very openly and was designed in a way that most thought should avoid bias. And these doctors discovered that it actually had this systematic bias, which was quite surprising, probably as surprising to the people who built the algorithm as anybody else, and very distressing to them as well. So where can this stuff come from? Well, the answer is everywhere, unfortunately. So we have this pipeline that I showed you, and we have data going in, we have answers coming out, and in between there's this mathematics that's going on to produce those answers and then improve the program that gives you those answers. And every step of that process can be a source of bias, both the simple bias and the sort of more problematic bias that correlates with race or gender or age or something like that. So the training data can just have pre-existing biases in it. That's just the way it goes, unfortunately. You have to be careful with your training data, and it's something you have to always be looking for. So recent studies have shown, for instance, that algorithms that are trained on newspaper articles going back 50 years in order to try and do natural language processing, it's called, like understand what people are saying, process human language, learn how to read, basically. They show a large amount of gender bias. And the reason is that there is, unfortunately, a large amount of gender bias in a lot of reporting. So if you feed in a bunch of gender biased or stereotyped anyhow input, you'll get stereotyped output, and the program just learns from the supervision you give it. So you have to be careful with your data. The techniques you use, they could have biased assumptions built in. If you build an algorithm and it encodes race or gender or age as a variable, and you treat that variable in some special way, it's possible that your algorithm just has some bias built into its very basic mathematics. It's possible. I mean, you could do it on purpose. It's also possible to do it by accident. And then, of course, the program gives you answers, but we're not at the point where, in many cases, we're just letting machine learning things run our lives for us. It's probably more often than many people would like that they're getting involved, but it's not the case. So for instance, the Compass algorithm that was predicting whether somebody would commit a crime again, all it was doing was providing a score. Judges were then supposed to use that score as they saw fit. And what the company who has made the algorithm said was, well, even if our algorithm was biased, we were just giving a score, and it's up to judges to interpret it. And it's not our fault if judges take that too seriously or take it in the wrong way. I'm not sure how seriously to take that, but you do always have to deal with the fact that the algorithm is going to tell you to do things or give you advice, and human beings are still going to act on that advice, and human beings do what human beings do. So there's things that, as a machine learning researcher, as I talk to my students, they can't do a lot about. You turn over a thing you've made to somebody and you say, it can give you answers, and they take the answers you give them and act in some way that's biased. Yes, that is probably not the algorithm's fault. But as you're collecting data, that's something that somebody building an algorithm can pay attention to. Is it their fault that there's historical bias in the data? Well, no, the history might not be their fault, but how you use that data is something you can think about. And then, of course, how you build the system and how you encode variables into the system, that's something that you have control over if you're doing this sort of research. And so it's something you want to think about and make sure you're not making biased assumptions. Now, I'm going to be wrapping up pretty quick here, but I'll just want to point out that this is a subtle and difficult problem. And for people who build these systems, it's a difficult problem. For people who live in a world in which these systems run, it's a difficult problem. But sources of bias can be really subtle. And so again, even if you can't control what human beings are going to do based on what a system tells them, because a system could be perfectly fair in whatever sense you want it to mean, and yet be used by people or ignored by people who don't want to act in a way that's fair. Even if you try to make sure the data that goes into these systems is unbiased, and if you try to make sure that the system isn't explicitly encoding bias into its system, it can still be tricky. So this is actually from that same health prediction algorithm paper. And what the authors of the paper note was that the people who built the algorithm that the hospitals were using really tried to avoid bias. In particular, they knew that there had been racially biased outcomes in medicine. It's not the only kind of bias that's been seen in medicine. There's been lots of gender bias in medicine and other things as well over the years. But in particular, to try and avoid racial bias in particular, they'd made sure that the race of a patient was never actually input to the model at all. So they were trying to build a model that was literally a program that was literally race blind, because you just don't tell the computer whether people are white, black, any other race. It presumably can't make decisions based on that in any way, shape, or form, because it just doesn't know. And there's no way for this program to peak either, they thought. So the sorts of things they were feeding in were things that they, and these were medical professionals who'd helped build this algorithm, this program, had decided were objective facts that related to health outcomes in objective ways and should be good predictors of whether people are really sick or not. And so what sorts of facts were they? Well, age was one of them. You know, it's an unfortunate fact of life. As we get older, our health often deteriorates. Sex/gender was another. There are different outcomes for different sorts of conditions depending on sex or gender, so that can be important. They looked at just people's records of prior health insurance claims. If somebody had shown a large number of claims for chronic conditions, that was evidence they had chronic conditions and was considered just their health record, essentially, as was their prior spending on healthcare. So they just looked at how many dollars that somebody spent in the past couple of years on healthcare as an important variable, figuring that people who spent a lot of money are often less healthy because they probably are spending money because they're getting treated for something. So the question was, why did we see this gap between the Black patients and the white patients on this algorithm score, if the fact that they're Black and white, that was something the doctors went and figured out after the fact and said, hey, look, this is what we're seeing. But the algorithm didn't know that. And so how is it systematically sort of exhibiting that kind of bias? Well, it turns out that if you talk to people who weren't just experts in certain kinds of medicine, but were sort of more experts in public health and had more knowledge of the American healthcare system and various other parts of it. This is an American study. That's the only reason I mentioned that. It turned out that these things they were measuring were not entirely race blind after all. And in particular, there was a hidden correlation that the people who built the algorithm did not really think of and didn't realize, I think, existed, or it didn't occur to them anyhow. But there was a hidden correlation between race and how much people spend on healthcare. Not every single person, but on average or as a group. And so what we're seeing here is another figure from the same paper. Is across the bottom here we have the chronic illnesses. So it's as you go to the right, you're getting sicker. And on the left, the y-axis, we see how much people were spending on average for medical care. And in this case, the white patients are higher than the Black patients, which means that if you pay attention to that variable, then there's a systematic correlation between the race of the person and how much they're spending on their healthcare when they have the same number of chronic health conditions. And in particular, white patients were spending significantly more than Black patients with the same set of conditions. So when the algorithm was trained, it said, oh, certain amounts of spending correlate with certain types of health outcomes. And it was just looking at some people were spending more than other people. And it was thinking that spending meant that they were sicker. And so that's why it was in part, large part really, saying that the white patients with the same scores were healthier, or this white patients with who were actually less sick were more sick, or that the Black patients who were actually as sick were less sick. And that was because of the spending. And it turned out that the spending, because again, this is the American health system, depends largely on access to insurance, the types of insurance you have, the easy access where you live to affordable healthcare, easy access to healthcare at all, willingness to spend on healthcare due to other biases that might exist in the healthcare system. And this was something they didn't reckon with, but it turned out that even though their algorithm, they thought, never knew what race people were, it knew something about those people that turned out to be a pretty decent indicator of what race they might be. And as a basis of that, not like the algorithm looked for a way to find race in the data, but it did. And this is what you might consider a hidden label. You don't think it's in the data. There's no way to tell something from that data. But when you crunch the numbers and you run it, it turns out that the algorithm's acting as if it knew something you didn't think it knew. And that's because there's something in the variable that tells it the fact that you didn't think it actually had any grasp on. So this is why bias in these programs can be so subtle and so difficult to ferret out until after the fact. It's often easy once you see the outcomes after some time, if somebody cares to look, oh, wow, there's some biased outcomes here. But we'd like to head those off before they happen, because people don't always look, and it's sometimes difficult to tell when you look if you're not careful. And so what we'd like is that our algorithms don't exhibit a bunch of bias and then we go back and fix them. That's nice if we can. What we will look for is that we can build them in ways that don't have it in the first place. And so I guess the question is how to do that when you may not even know that you're building bias into the algorithm in the first place. Anyway, that is pretty much all I had to say. I just want to throw this out there, and hopefully there will be some questions. This is the sort of thing I would do with my class here at Tufts, and we'd look at a case like this, and then it would be a question. It wasn't a question of, oh, geez, isn't that unfortunate? The question would be, okay, under what conditions is this ethical or not? What sorts of responsibilities do we have to fix these problems and avoid these problems? What frameworks can we use to analyze what should and shouldn't be done with technology and with computers and machine learning? And it was a really fun class. We talked about a lot of interesting things. We read a lot of philosophy so we could talk about these things in an informed way. And I hope to have some conversation with you as well about this.
Great. Thank you so much, Marty, for this really clear, especially for someone who isn't into computing, except as a user, introduction of the concept of bias, both from the framework of error and what you learn from, an unintentional error, but also how it translates into bias and wrong decisions for people and very big issues such as healthcare. So thank you very much for being so clear and so detailed. You mentioned a little bit at the end of the presentation about your class, and it's interesting because they had to take into consideration bias that you can fix and that you really, to some extent, can't avoid, and bias that actually could be damaging to the populations, even in the early phases when it's being used. And one question I had is, were you ever surprised by some of the conclusions the students came up with to these ethical issues? I mean, did everybody sort of come out in one place, or did you have a range of different approaches? And, how do you think in the minds of our current young people, they're approaching these issues and they maybe change during your course, and how affects all the people like me who are aging and are just computer illiterate, and will be receiving all kinds of services throughout the rest of our lives that will incorporate these bias and have these issues underlying them.
Well, I think it was good news, you know. I mean, I definitely didn't, when I taught this course, I did not set out to create a course in teaching people how to be ethical, because I don't A, think I have all those answers, and B, think that's something I can teach directly. But what I wanted to do was to give these students, who largely, because I'm in a computer science department and it was a computer science class, largely are aiming towards technical careers in the business side and the actual building side. Just the experience of, okay, let's think about things like this. It wasn't the only sort of thing we talked about, but things like this, and ask ourselves, are there ethical questions here? How do we assess them? What conclusions do we come to? So that later, when they're building their own systems, working in companies that employ or sell systems like this, they might ask those questions and at least start a debate and talk about it. And the great news was, I wasn't surprised, because tough students are very forward about the fact that they think about these things. But people were very thoughtful, and they really responded positively to the idea of asking those questions and wrestling with them. And people came to different conclusions, but they were often, about what you could do about these things. So there are differences of opinion about, exactly how wrong a thing might be, or whether it's wrong at all. But I wasn't faced with a huge amount of, no, I'm a technician, I don't need to think about these things. There's no ethical questions here. I just built something, it works or it doesn't. People were really interested in thinking about that and taking responsibility for it, and wanting to wrestle with it. So I think the good news for anybody who has to live in a world that technologists build is that at least some of these young technologists are coming out thinking about these things and interested in making ethical decisions about them and avoiding those sorts of biases. It's something they actually care a lot about.
That's great. Well, that's really important going forward, because like I say, so many of us trust without questioning in what's being provided to us. I think that that if the people underlying are thinking, that's great. We have a question from Sharon Weinstock, and she says, as more decisions are turned over to computers and fewer humans have an understanding of the inputs, how will bias be detected and addressed going forward?
That's a great question. It is one of the toughest parts of this, is that it's just part of the difficulty of living in the modern world, I think, is that the number of competencies you need to navigate the world just seems to increase at a regular pace. And so, the compass algorithm, as an example, the one that predicted whether people would commit crimes or not, the company's defense when they were told, people said this algorithm appeared to be biased, was, we said from the beginning, this risk score is just a rough prediction because we can't predict the future. Judges are supposed to take into account that there's lots of other factors and they need to pay attention to it. And what my students would say, and they're right, and it goes to this question is, well, the thing is that a judge is a legal expert. You hope anyway. I mean, if they're an expert at anything, that should be the one thing. And nobody expects a judge to be an expert in machine learning and statistics and whatever methods were used to build this. But they're being given a score, and one person has a higher, riskier score than another. That's the decision they base it on. They can't evaluate how this algorithm got there. Even if you explained every detail of it, they might not be able to evaluate that. And that's fine. That's not what they were trained to do. So what we actually need, I think, are groups that work together, both in government, business, all levels of society, from the everyday people whose lives are being impacted by these algorithms, to the people building them, to the people, sort of largely running the society to some extent that we live in, where you have all these different types of expertise. And that's really what we need, is we need to involve more people in looking at these things, because, you know, some cases of bias, people don't detect them because they don't even know what it looks like. You know, it never occurred to you that this is a biased outcome in the first place, or if it did occur to you, you didn't care. And you need people for whom it actually matters to be involved. So you need the people that these algorithms are being used to predict about, or, you know, change their lives, to be involved. You need the people who know how to build them and how to make them better and how they work in the first place to be involved. And you need the people who are experts in things like public health to tell you, hey, spending on healthcare in America is differential by race. That's actually an important thing to know. You need all these experts and everyday people to be involved. So it actually requires that people pay attention, and that, you know, we get lots of groups involved, I think. That's basically, because there isn't going to be any one individual who's going to know enough to be able to sort out some of these situations.
Do you think your course is a course that every tough student should take? Because, as you say, no matter what field they go into, this is going to impact the work they do. Should your course be a required course?
My course, literally no, because then I'd have to grade every student at Tufts, and I don't think I could actually sustain that. I got up at 2:30
You'd
in
need
the
to
morning
create
today
some
to finish
clones,
grading.
but
But courses like that, yeah. I mean, I definitely had students who said it. I'm not going to insist anybody take my course, but I think I believe that people ought to be thinking about the ethical and social outcomes of whatever it is they're doing, right? I mean, we owe it to one another as human beings to think about each other as human beings. And I don't believe that engineers, scientists, technical people get to be exempt from that. And so, you know, one of the reasons we offered this course in the computer science department is we didn't want it to be the case that we implicitly or other, like we said, oh, we could just require that all our students go to the philosophy department and take an ethics course. But we thought that that would sort of create this picture where, okay, the computer science is what us computer science professors do, and that's what we actually care about. And then the ethics is something that happens further up the hill, and somebody else cares about it, and it's their job to think about it. And you're all really computer science majors. Yeah, you had to take a philosophy course, but that's not actually what you're supposed to care about. And so we put it in the computer science department because we wanted it to be something that said, no, this is a computer science course. So I think there's versions of this that probably everybody should be taking. I think it's good for you. I don't know that I would have said that at every point in my life. There probably were points where I was more willing to be the nerdy nose to the grindstone. You know, I like to think about the math and how the math works, and I don't want to think about the rest of the world, but that's changed. Perhaps I've mellowed.
no, I think everybody needs a good old course in some form of appropriate ethics in their careers these days. But anyway, we have
it's
another,
true. Yeah.
sorry, another audience question. Given the attributes and features like race, given that, I think he meant to say attributes, features like race are baked into other attributes, features included in the model, would you still recommend leaving race out of the model? It seems more important about what you do with the model findings regarding race than to leave it out.
Yeah, that's a great question too. And you know, honestly, I would say leave it in because it does actually make the sort of at least biases based like correlated with race that makes that more obvious, because you can immediately look at the outcomes. You can even automate this part of it and you know, sort of go back and analyze and say, okay, now go take a pass through and take the race variable and see if it's unduly correlated with errors that you make. And you're not hiding it. And nobody was intending to hide anything in that algorithm that we talked about, the health one. I think they were just as dismayed, if not more so than anyone else, that the paper came out. But I would say actually keep it in, because it seems like it can creep in anyway. And you might be doing it in a way that you have more trouble detecting if you're not looking at it. Now, if you're writing race into your algorithm and say, if the person is of race blank, make this error, then yes, of course, that's problematic. But again, if somebody's got that in their code, you can see it in their code if they're that obvious about it, as opposed to if they spend this much, do what? You know, somebody devious could have used secret coding to hide that sort of thing. Again, not what was going on here, but yeah, for sure. So I'd say leave it in.
That's fascinating. It just shows me how much I don't take into consideration what the person creating whatever function I'm using has been thinking about and their possible motivations. So it's fascinating insight. But yeah.
Yeah,
And
human beings are
Joseph,
involved. So
yeah, exactly. It's probably impossible to eliminate bias in that case. But we have another question from Joseph Padula. And he says there are so many instances where race bias is a major issue, such as achievement testing, employment screening, etc. Shouldn't race be examined routinely for bias in all ML routines?
yeah, I mean, I think that there is I mean, trust academics and technologists. I mean, this became a hot research topic in recent years. You know, some of these cases come out, and then a lot of smart people who do machine learning started thinking about, well, how would we detect bias, and how would we screen for racial, gender, et cetera, you know, various types of pernicious bias? How would we detect it? How would we define it? How would we remove it? Can we automate that process so we can have programs to get rid of the bias in our other programs? And that is definitely something people have proposed, that this be part of an auditing process of systems like this. There's been for years now this proposal, and in some companies it's actually fact, security audits, right? Because one of the other big topics that has an ethical dimension is, you know, is this program secure? Is your data safe? And so people do audits of programs for that. And it's been argued that you should have audits of programs for this sort of bias, just as importantly, if not more so.
Great. I've got two more questions that I'd like to pose to you, but we've got only 2 minutes by my reckoning. So if you could be a little bit quick on answering, I'm sorry to rush you. A few questions came in very quickly at the end. The first one is, would it work to create and require an ethics survey with a range of speakers talking about ethics in a number of areas, computer science, algorithms, medical, legal issues, etc.?
Yeah, I think that'd be a great idea. It would be nice because if you can, you know, have people from different disciplines, it reaches people with different interests who sometimes need somebody who thinks like them, quote unquote, to explain why it matters to them.
Great, thank you. And the last one is one I could have written myself, but it was written by Mary Beth Rison instead, is can you suggest any online resources for the layperson to learn more about this issue?
Yeah, the MIT, I don't have the links right now, but if you look up there's an MIT case studies in CS or computer science ethics, and there's one at Harvard as well. I think it's ethics with CS capitalized, like computer science. They have a number of resources, ties to philosophical reading examples and stuff. Those are just two I can think of off the top of my head. Tufts is actually, we're building one ourselves, so it's not ready for public consumption yet.
Oh, great. Well, for the audience, stay tuned then. But great. Well, Marty, thank you so much again for what, like I say, such a clear and interesting presentation on all these issues, and really helping me understand how it fits into my life and how it's important. I know I myself could have kept you busy for another hour with questions, and I'm sorry we don't have that extra hour. But I just wanted to thank you for being with us tonight, and thank you to all the audience also for being with us for such an important and timely topic. So
yeah, thanks everybody. It was nice to sort of talk to you. Hopefully some year we do this again. I can actually see a few people in person. I'd be happy to stick around and answer questions that way.
I know London has first dibs on you for an in-person presentation, so.
If somebody wants to pay my
and
way
I
to
hope
London,
everybody
we
will.
can do it virtually.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if somebody wants to pay my way to London, we can do it tomorrow, but otherwise virtual is always possible. So.
Good, great. Well, thank you again. And once again to the audience, feel free to look up the remaining events for this reunion week. And thank you for being with us.